Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this evening's meeting of the Ethical Governance Committee. In order to assist in the process this evening, I must ask everyone to ensure that their mobile phones are either switched off or on silent mode. We'd be grateful if you would remain quiet while the meeting is in progress. I'd like to remind everyone present that this meeting will be filmed by the Council and broadcast live on the internet and will be capable of repeated viewing. If you are seated in the chamber, it is possible that the cameras will capture your image. By your presence, you are deemed to consent to be filmed and to the use of these images and sound recordings for webcasting and or training purposes. As the chairman of the meeting, I can, at my discretion, terminate or suspend filming if, in my opinion, continuing to do so would prejudice the proceedings of the meeting, or if I consider that continued filming might infringe the rights of any individual or breach any statutory provisions. Finally, there are no planned fire drills for this evening. If the fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the building immediately via the emergency exit. Right, I think you've all heard that before a few times, but we do have to go through the actual. Thank you. Right, as chairman of the previous year's Ethical Governance Committee, it's my job to start this meeting off. Now we've done the formal bits we had to get through. So the first item on the agenda is election of chairman. Do we have any proposal for the chairman, please?
As you were chairman last year and you have stood down as chairman of the community committee, I propose you carry on as chairman for the chairman.
Sorry, we need to use the microphones as well, Chairman. This is for the remainder of the 2017-18 municipal year. So Councillor Mrs Darren Wilkes actually already holds a position of chairman. So normally you wouldn't hold more than one position as chairman of a committee. So I must stress that this is only until May the 14th, 15th, whatever that date is.
Thank you. Sue?
Yeah,
thank you very much. Right, we've got two proposals, no seconder.
Well, I can't vote them anyway.
No, you would normally be a chairman of two committees.
Yeah, I can't be chairman.
You can't.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, so seconder.
Sorry.
Seconder? For Sue? Oh, sorry, for Claire?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Right, let's go to the vote then. Those in favour, please, of Claire. Thank you. Okay, Claire, let's swap places.
Thank you, Sally. Go to item 2 on the agenda, election of vice chairman. Do I have a proposal for the vice chairman? Thank you.
Anybody can be vice chairman.
Councillor Bungay is proposed. Do we have a seconder?
Happy with that, yeah.
Any other proposals? No, we'll go to the vote in that case. All those in favour? Okay, that's carried. Okay, we go to item number 3 on the agenda. Apologies for absence.
Yes, I have apologies from Councillor Fox and Councillor Hallam.
Thank you. Item number 4, declarations of interest. Members are reminded that any disclosable pecuniary interest must be declared, including any issues which may arise through predetermination or bias. Pro forma is available in the members' room. Do we have any declarations of interest? No? Okay.
If in view of item 6, I'm actually a member of the planning committee, whether that should be declared or not, but I see Mr. Jones is shaking his head, so forget that.
Item number 5, minutes of the previous meeting. Do we have confirmation that they're correct minutes of the last meeting, which I wasn't present at, so can somebody propose who was there? Do I have a seconder? The only other person who was there was Colin, so good, seconder. All those in favour of those minutes? That's carried. Item number 6, mandatory training for members to set out proposed revisions to the Constitution which require members to undertake compulsory training when deemed necessary. And I believe Jane Lynch is here, Head of Planning, to run us through this one.
Yes, thank you. I'll just start with a bit of background as to where this recommendation has come from. Members may recall that back at the end of 2017, we were visited by the Planning Advisory Service, PAS, to conduct a review of the planning committee process. This was part of a wider package of support that they offered that was agreed by the chairman and vice chairman as being positive towards ensuring that we were not actually designated as being poor performing and put into special measures. We've been identified as being in the danger zone on the basis of our performance at appeals, which is seen as a measure of quality. I can confirm that it has been confirmed that we actually have not been designated. We were above the threshold for that. As part of that review, officers and members from both councils were interviewed and a committee meeting from each council was observed. In looking at the work of the committee, PAS concentrated on the need to make decisions that can, if necessary, be defended on appeal, but also considered areas where the committee procedure could impact on the timeliness of the decision making and thus a target for dealing with applications in the future. Now, following that visit, they provided a report which detailed their findings and made some recommendations, and one of those is what we have brought in front of you tonight, which is set out in your report at paragraph 2.3. I will just read it. It states, require all members to undertake compulsory refresher training. It would not be reasonable to require them to attend all the short pre-committee update sessions, but perhaps institute a requirement for attendance at an agreed percentage of them, and also to consider a few longer sessions that would be compulsory to attend or a longer annual refresher. It was considered that it would be reasonable for this requirement to come from the council solicitor or monitoring officer. Following the submission of that report, we discussed the findings and the recommendations with the chairman and vice chairman of both councils, and it was agreed that an annual refresher session for all existing planning committee members should be made a compulsory requirement, along with any bespoke planning sessions that were needed in response to changes, the frequent changes that we still experience through the government planning policy. We would expect that such compulsory training sessions in a normal year would probably be no more than 2 or 3. It was also agreed by the chairman and vice chairman that it would be the final authority to make a training session mandatory should be given to the chairman and vice chairman of the planning committee for Christchurch. Now, this proposal for the compulsory training for planning committee was put in front of the Partnership Member Development Working Group in March of this year, and they supported that recommendation, but they also suggested that this should be taken wider through the council and that there would be occasions when it would be beneficial for the working of the council for all members to be required to attend certain training sessions. And that's not just about planning, that's about any other important elements of the business that you do. And the example given at that meeting was the forthcoming training, well, I think actually most of it has now happened, on general data protection regulations that come in the next few weeks. Turning then to the top of page 9 and constitutional changes, it sets out there how training is currently required in the council's constitution, and you will see that there is currently no provision for making any training sessions mandatory. So the next section under point 3.4 sets out the changes that are proposed in this report that would make both planning training compulsory for members of the planning committee on given occasions, and also for members of the council for other purposes as deemed necessary. So in conclusion, at paragraph 5.1, the proposed requirement for specific training sessions to be made mandatory will ensure that members have the appropriate knowledge to carry out their duties in a robust and legally sound manner. Thank you.
Thank you for that very comprehensive report. I know, as having been sat on planning committee, we have already sort of visited some of this through the planning committee, but I think it's really useful that it's come to ethical governance and the changes that are proposed. Do we have any questions for the officer, please? Yes, Colin.
Thank you, Chairman. I can understand it being mandatory for members that are on planning, but I think it would be useful for non-planning members to be allowed to attend as well on planning training, because sometimes we get it wrong and wonder why a decision has been made or something was said because we haven't been party to the training in the past. I mean, a lot of us that have been here and been on planning for many years, but that was 15, 20 years ago for me, and legislation and things have changed. So I'd like it thrown open to those that wish to attend that aren't on planning, if that's possible.
That was also a point that was raised by the working group, that they felt it would be beneficial for everybody to have access to the planning training. Now, I think what we would do for the planning committee would have to be quite detailed and very specific to the type of decisions they make. But what we have agreed we would do is hold a general training session in May or early June for all members. It was thought that that was probably not a session that needed to be mandatory, because that is members who wish to improve their planning knowledge in order to assist in the duties that they carry out within their local wards. So yes, we will be doing that. It could be made mandatory. That would not be a decision for me to make. We have put that down for the leader, but if the leader felt it was necessary for all members to have that degree of basic knowledge, that's absolutely fine. We will be doing that.
Thank you.
Sally.
Of it, please, because I'm well aware that we had some training last week, and I know there were several sessions of it, but I'm really not sure how many people turned up. There were perhaps 3 or 4 in the one I was at. Thank you.
With planning, I think that's quite straightforward, that if something is deemed to be compulsory, any member who hadn't attended the training session or any of the training sessions that had been laid on would not be able to serve on the next planning committee and would not be able to take part in any committee meeting until such time as they had that training, which we would of course reorganise. When it comes to wider things, I think if I can ask Richard perhaps to go back to the Constitution.
I mean, in terms of monitoring members' attendance, we will do that through the training sessions and organise that. I think clearly, if you make it a rule, it is technically then a breach of your constitution and your code. So if a training session is deemed to be mandatory, then failure to attend would be a breach.
So can I come back on that? Yes, of course it's a breach, but what happens? What are the consequences?
I think that depends on the item of training. So, for instance, if you had code of conduct training that was made mandatory, and we'll come on to that in a moment, then clearly you will not perhaps be fulfilling your role, and therefore you could get complaints about you as an individual. And I know the sanctions are quite limited. We'll come on to that a little bit later on. But that would follow that you could have a potential complaint. If it related to a particular subject, and there aren't going to be many cases where these training sessions are mandatory, but licensing is another example where the same would apply. You wouldn't be allowed to serve on that committee. You could argue if you had finance related training and you deemed it to be necessary to understand budgets, then it may be that you couldn't determine matters related to finance. But that depends on the mandatory training itself. So I think that would be the sanction probably in terms of the committee side. I think it's in terms of code of conduct related matters, then that would be a potential complaint if you weren't adhering to the code that was delivered through that training process.
Excuse me, keep coming back on this, but that is so far, and I understand that. But who is going to enforce this? Who's the complaint coming from?
Maybe I can help. Yeah.
Yes, Colin.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll refer to the 3 supermarkets, which you weren't here at, but were you here, Richard? You were here. Yeah, Daniel was here. So as you know, that we had mandatory training before that, and there were 2 members. I think you were one, when you Sue, and Peter Hall was the other one, who weren't able to attend. They couldn't participate in the debate on this important matter until they had been trained, and there was separate training that was held to allow them to be. Do you remember this? Yeah. So I'm assuming that, may I assume is my question, that would be the same, because not everybody is all available at a time that suits council officers or all other council members when they're trying to arrange training. So I just wondered if you would have a second opportunity to be trained on something when you weren't available the first time.
I think we've covered that point. Are you happy with that, Sally, or is there something that you still wanted to come back on? Or Richard actually wants to come back on that.
If I can just, I apologise, I'm jumping slightly ahead, but I've circulated a paper on your desk, and on that paper on page 2 and page 3, I outline your terms of reference of your committee. So in terms of your enforcement of members' training, the very last bullet point in the list on page 3 of that document says that your committee is responsible to oversee and monitor the delivery of the members' development strategy to enable members to effectively perform their duties. So if a member is persistently failing to attend mandatory training, I would recommend that I would bring that back to your attention at this committee, because you are responsible for ensuring members are adequately trained to deliver their role and to undertake their duties as a councillor. So you are potentially one of those enforcers in making that delivery of training. But coming back to the other point, I am sure that if a member is unable to attend a training session, we will deliver that in a second session without question.
Are you happy?
Thank you. That you or whoever is in your role will be bringing it back to committee. It's not us that are going to be bringing it back. An officer will. Thank you. Yes, it wasn't so much planning I was thinking about. It was other meetings, and I am well aware that there have been members in the past who have persistently not turned up to training. So I'll be glad something will be followed up. Thank you.
Good point. Are there any other questions? Okay, so I'll open it up to debate. Who would like to start the debate on this?
Can I just say, I'm not quite sure. Thank you. I'll have to get used to doing that. I'm not quite sure I understand the wording in para 3.1, and I know this would come to scrutiny committee, but it's rather a strange sort of way of putting things. Don't participate, like it's telling you.
That's the current code, and then the changes are below. So are you querying the current code for training?
So part 5D. So where is the current and proposed? I think is probably what I'm trying to get at.
Could I ask the officer for clarification? Oh, Jane. Jane?
Yes, under point 3, 3.1 and 3.2 are what it states in the current constitution.
Yeah.
Under 3.4 in the table 3b, scheme of delegation and general obligations, it's that is the proposed wording.
Okay, well, it's, if I may say so, it's not clear. It's not clear that, because we normally have the two alongside each other, if you see what I mean. It was proposed to redline the ones that's proposed to go and then have the other one in.
I think it's referring to a different part of the code, so it's changing something in a different part of the code to accommodate the change. I'll refer over to the officer.
Chairman, if I can just explain, I think, and Jane will correct me if I'm wrong, but 3.1, 3.2 are explaining what the current wording of the Constitution is. It's not proposing that that's changed. It's just advising that that is the wording in relation to any training that is to be delivered for members. 3.4 then deals with the proposal to include that as an additional wording within the Constitution to reinforce the fact that there will be mandatory training determined. So it's complementary to the 3.1, 3.2.
Any more questions before we go to debate? No? Okay. Sally, did you want to start the debate?
Having read this through carefully, sorry about that. Having read this through carefully, I just thought the whole thing was very sensible. I would like to make sure that members do go to all the training that we're given. The council does spend quite a lot of time preparing training for us, and if we ourselves aren't properly prepared, I don't think we should then be taking part in meetings and debates. So I'm really pleased to see this come forward, and I propose the recommendation as it's set out. Thank you.
Thank you. That's been proposed. Do we have a seconder for that? Yes, Councillor Jameson. Happy to second. Is there any more debate? Sue?
I've got a slight issue with the word ensure that you have relevant skills and knowledge to perform. That presumably depends on the individual, and unfortunately not everyone is as honest as Councillor Bungay has been in saying it was some time ago that you had last sat on a planning committee or had any training in relation to planning. I fear that there may be certain members who feel that because of their experience they have got the relevant skills and knowledge. I'm just wondering, is there a stronger word that we could use at all?
Any of the officers like to suggest a stronger word?
Well, that's a general obligation. The actual obligation for compulsory comes in part 3b, the scheme of delegation, whereby the head of planning in consultation with the chairman and vice chairman of planning committee could identify any particular session. Let's just use the new national planning policy framework that's going to come out. The key policies in there you are going to need to know about if you are on the planning committee, and you shouldn't sit on that planning committee unless you have had the training that goes with that, so that you understand the changing context within which you must make your decisions. So on occasions like that, that would be made mandatory, so there would be no option. And if you hadn't attended that training, it would be the case that you then would not be able to take part in any planning committee meeting until we had had the opportunity to give you that training. So I think ensure is the right word to use under 4.1 as a general obligation, that it's something that you all have. As to we as officers, we need to make sure we have the knowledge necessary to carry out our roles, but some things are of greater importance, and as we've said, those will be fewer and far between than the general matters. But in planning this year, I am expecting there to be quite a number of significant changes coming forward.
Okay, thank you.
Any more debate before we go to the vote on this? Okay, we'll go to the vote. All those in favour of the recommendations? It's carried. Thank you very much, Jane. Now we go to item number 7, review of local government ethical standards stakeholder consultation. To consider a consultation paper published by the Committee on Standards in Public Life and to respond accordingly. And I know that Richard has put on your desks some suggested responses which we can go through in a minute, but if we can first come to Richard to run through this piece that we have to have a look at.
Very briefly, Chairman, you've introduced obviously the Committee for Standards in Public Life undertaking the consultation. The deadline for responses is the 18th of May. I apologise for the time scale. There's not a huge amount of time here. This paper actually wasn't drawn to my MO. I didn't receive a direct communication. It was drawn to my attention by somebody else. So again, the period is squeezed, but we have got time from that point of view. The paper is structured in certain sections, and they're detailed as headings in paragraph 4.1 of your report, A to G. As you said, Chairman, I have, rather than you starting from a blank piece of paper, and obviously it's up to you how you wish to respond, I have produced some suggested responses on a supplementary paper. If you agree with these, clearly we will reproduce all of these within the minutes in full. Obviously the transparency for the public point of view, but they are my suggestions as the MO and observations from other colleagues and so on. But again, it's very much for you to add to those, take those, edit those, take bits out as you feel free. Quite how you wish to deal with that. I mean, obviously I appreciate you've only fairly recently had that. So whether you wish to read the responses to each question, they are set out A to K. So the first section is on the second page of my paper that I've circulated, questions A and B. And then in the box below that, I've drafted my response for you to consider.
Thank you very much. I think that'd be really helpful. I just wanted to ask members, first of all, if you have any general questions on this item prior to going through it in detail. Yes, Colin.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I am concerned that Richard, in his capacity as officer, has only just been informed of this, because it came out on the 29th of January. And we've basically got 2 or 3 weeks to respond to it now, rather than several weeks. And it does also allow for other stakeholders to be involved in this, like local businesses, local associations, even ordinary private members of the public. And I've certainly had several phone calls and a couple of emails complaining that why haven't we been notified of this, because we might wish to comment. And hearing what Richard said earlier, he's only just been made aware of this. It does concern me that the government put out something like this but don't actually broadcast it to anybody. So you could find on the 18th of May they got little or no response and think everything's wonderful in the garden and there are no problems anywhere across the country. So I am concerned that for some reason this has been sitting on someone's shelf gathering dust since January. I don't know if Richard can answer that.
I'm not here to defend the government. It is a government consultation. They've published it on their website. I suspect there are mechanisms to receive alerts. I haven't got an alert on this particular paper. It hasn't just hit my desk before. I've probably had it 4 or 5 weeks and so on. But again, in terms of timing the meetings, I haven't had the opportunity. It's not clearly our responsibility to engage with the other stakeholders locally. I appreciate they've only picked this up because we've published it on our agenda, and clearly they're more than welcome to do that and to respond direct. So I can't really add much more than that. Really, it's a government consultation paper. It's been published on their website.
Thank you, Richard. Are there any other general questions before we go through the document itself? Okay, so can I suggest that we start on item A, which is on the second page of Richard's paper. Are the existing structures, processes and practices in place working to ensure high standards of conduct by local councillors? If not, please say why. And as Richard has said, he's put a proposed, from his comments that he's received and his experience, a proposed response. I suggest that we all read through that, and then if we want to add or change to that, we can do it, and we can go one by one through all of them if members are happy with that approach. If Councillor Bungay would like to ask a question on that.
Thank you. In A, paragraph 3, the council's process for handling complaints of misconduct, well tried, etc. Sanctions available are 2 weeks. The council does not receive significant numbers of complaints of misconduct. Doesn't make that clear whether that's from our residents or from within the council, or is that covering both? Because I think that needs a bit of clarification.
That statement's covering both, and it's also covering, bear in mind we are in partnership, it's also covering parish and town council. So as MO for Christchurch and East Dorset, I will investigate complaints of code of conduct against parish and town councillors, as well as district and borough councillors. So the numbers are low from both internally and externally.
Thank you.
Have we all had a chance to read through item A? Are we all happy with that response?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I take the point from Councillor Bungay about the sanctions that we have, and we have discussed this before. I think it was here and in the when we were talking about the constitution changes at the scrutiny and overview and scrutiny committee, that there don't appear to be any sanctions if somebody is doing something that is seriously wrong, and I think that is probably worthy of comment.
I think further on in the paper there is that aspect to it, so I think that is covered quite adequately a little bit later on, so if we can just pause on that until we get to that.
I'm just referring to A in the agenda, which says, are the existing structures, process and practice in place working to ensure high standards of conduct by local councillors? If not, please say why.
I think you'll find that if once we get towards the end, if it isn't fully covered, then we can come back to this to try and add some more weight to it. But I think you'll find when we get further on, you'll find that that is actually covered.
I was just responding to A.
Thank you. Any other comments on that, or changes or additions you want to make? Oh, and at this point in time, I'm sorry, Ian, I haven't welcomed you to the table and offered you the opportunity to contribute as well. Ian Sibley, who is our independent person. Welcome, and I'm sorry that I didn't welcome you before. So if there's any comments you'd like to make or to this, it would be very much appropriate.
Very great. Very.
Okay, so we will leave item A for the time being as stands until we get to the end, and then if Colin requires us to add any more, then we can come back to it. Question B, what, if any, are the most significant gaps in the current ethical standards regime for local government? So I'll allow you some time to read B, which is a little bit shorter.
Okay, well, I take the point from Councillor Bungay about the sanctions that we have, and we have discussed this before. I think it was here and in the when we were talking about the constitution changes at the scrutiny and overview committee, that there don't appear to be any sanctions if somebody is doing something that is seriously wrong, and I think that is probably worthy of comment.
I think further on in the paper there is that aspect to it, so think Sally wanted to come back on that.
Wanted to comment on the second paragraph and to say it was a point that I had considered in recent years was not helpful to anybody really, and I'm glad that you've brought it in here that councillors can be criminalised for minor lapses, and under the previous scheme that would have been dealt with at a local level. So thank you for bringing that in.
Chairman, if I can also, that is quite a short section there. There is another section I do expand on it. So in responses to question G, there's a little bit more explanatory note on that one as well in terms of declaring interest, because I think it is a weakness of the current system.
Yes. Okay, if you're all happy with that.
Can I just,
Colin, sorry.
may I just
Colin
help?
Jameson.
Okay. The question, as it stands in D in the agenda,
We're
these-
on B at the moment.
sorry, I beg your pardon, B.
Yeah, what if any are the most significant gaps?
I was being dyslexic. I apologise.
Okay.
Please carry on.
Colin Bungay.
Thank you, Chair. I think this criminalisation comes back to the lack of sanctions again, which we referred to in the previous one. So each one we seem to be coming back to the same situation and problem. So I have more to say about that later, but it is a problem obviously that we have, which is carrying all the way through.
Are you happy if we move on to C now? Yeah. Okay. Are local authority adopted codes of conduct for councillors clear and easily understood? Do the codes cover an appropriate range of behaviours? What examples of good practice, including induction processes, exist? And the response is at the bottom of page 3 and then the top of page 4. Any comments or additions to that? Okay, we'll move on to D. The local authority has a statutory duty to ensure that its adopted code of conduct for councillors is consistent with the 7 principles of public life, and that it includes appropriate provision, as decided by the local authority, for registering and declaring councillors' interests. Are these requirements appropriate as they stand? If not, please say why. Responses overleaf on page 4. Okay, is everyone happy with that response? Yep. Okay, we'll go on to E, investigations and decisions on allegations. And E comes into 3 parts, 1, 2 and 3, but the response is just in 1 part. So I'll read out the whole of E and then you can read through the draft response. Are allegations of councillor misconduct investigated and decided fairly and with due process? 1. What processes do local authorities have in place for investigating and deciding upon allegations? Do these processes meet requirements for due process? Should any additional safeguards be put in place to ensure due process? 2. Is the current requirement that the views of an independent person must be sought and taken into account before deciding on an allegation sufficient to ensure the objectivity and fairness of the decision process? Should this requirement be strengthened? If so, how? 3. Monitoring officers are often involved in the process of investigating and deciding upon code breaches. Could monitoring officers be subject to conflicts of interest or undue pressure when doing so? How could monitoring officers be protected from this risk? So if I can let you read the draft response, and then we can see if you want to add or amend that. We all had a chance to read through the response. Are there any comments or additions?
I'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, Colin Bungay.
Before Richard's time as monitoring officer, I do recollect an occasion where a complaint was made by an outside person, which wasn't followed up. For what reasons, I don't know, but they were very unhappy. What I'd like to know is if a resident or a member lodges a complaint against a member and the monitoring officer decides in their wisdom that they're not going to follow it up, there is no justification for it, does the complainant have any right of appeal to anyone?
They can consult the independent person who would give them a view. So whenever I resolve, I can't look backwards to be fair, former cases. But when I receive a complaint, I will investigate it. I will consider. Sometimes they are tit for tat. They may be frivolous. They may not have any substance. They may be actually against the decision of the council rather than an actual code of conduct related matter. So they can be dismissed, but I would always consult with the independent person and provide them with a copy of the complaint. We don't get very many, I'll be honest. So in that sense, but they would always consult, and that independent person could be contacted by the complainant or the complainee. If it's about a councillor, the councillor can also liaise with the independent person on findings that I may draw as well from that complaint.
And Jameson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Could I just ask Richard if the MO function also extends to parish councils and parish councillors?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so I think the significant part is the final two paragraphs of the pressure that may be exerted. You know, if I may say that somebody is complaining about the leader of the council, and the leader of the council by his position is normally quite a powerful person, and could exert influence, undue pressure on the monitoring officer. And in my view, it may be appropriate to be able to call on an outside monitoring officer to come along and pick up that function. And I think that would be an appropriate comment that we should have in here.
That is also available to me, so I can. There is an option to have an independent review of a complaint as well. So that's where I would bring in somebody, perhaps from another monitoring officer, to investigate something as well. So we do have that provision already available.
Yeah, I think the significance of this would have been apparent to anybody who was on the county council when the leader of the then county council had inadvertently failed to declare something for which he lost his lost his role. So it is important that we get that absolutely right. Very often, external provision is the only way you can do it, but it needs to be done in a balanced way.
I can add a sentence to that paragraph, that penultimate paragraph of that section, to say where appropriate, an independent investigation or investigator is drawn upon. But that is in our scheme already, so we do have that. But I can highlight that as good practice what we have available to us.
It's just that it's not reflected. I don't think it's reflected necessarily in the question.
I think that'd be useful.
And I think the issue is how do you decide? How do you decide whether you're going to get somebody who is impartial? Who makes that
decision?
I think it would be myself as monitoring officer. I mean, I am in a position of impartiality. I'm a politically restricted post. Normally it's held at a senior level in terms of investigation, the MO. I have a deputy monitoring officer at a strategic level, and I have the independent person that I would consult with. If I felt under undue pressure, I would certainly consult with my colleagues in that role. And if I had to deem to give it to an independent investigator, I would do that. But I think I don't feel that pressure. There is certainly no undue pressure that I've ever experienced, and I would hope that the members we have, but I appreciate some councils that may be different.
And in the future, if I may come back, Madam Chairman, that may be different as well, because we can't write and amend the Constitution on what is happening today. It's what may happen tomorrow, and that's the point. So you mention in here that you have the independent person to whom with whom you can consult, I think is the point on how you may or may not take that forward, that issue forward. Thank you. Okay.
Sally.
Thank you, Claire. I just would like to know, please, whose name this response is going back in. Is it Richard's who's done all the work on it initially? Is it the council? Is it the committee? I'll explain my reasons for wanting to know in a minute.
It will be your response to the consultation. In your terms of reference, you do have, and I know it's there somewhere, but you actually have the authority to respond to consultation papers by government, local government associations or other bodies. So it'll be in the name of the committee on behalf of the council.
Thank you for that. That's what I thought I understood. As you explained at the beginning, you've put these words together, and I'm very grateful to you for doing so. I wouldn't like to have to spend the time trying to work it all out. And we've only had them before us tonight, so we haven't had a lot of time to read and think about other things to be here. But I was just, the paragraph that we have been talking about, I just thought perhaps the very last sentence wasn't right, because there has certainly not been any undue pressure for the current officer. As we as a committee, we don't actually know what pressure you've had. This is your writing, isn't it? Not our as a committee. I don't know if everybody feels the same, but that's how it read to me.
Sorry, Chairman, I can reword that to say that the committee was advised and that there was no undue pressure by the current post order.
You understand?
Yeah, no, I understand what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that might be more appropriate. Thank you. Collins.
Yes, it's always concerned me that the monitoring officer is an internal employee, because taking Councillor Jameson's comments earlier about the then leader of Dorset County Council and what happened there, the monitoring officer at the end of the day still has to work with that councillor, that leader or whatever. And I think it does put the monitoring officer in an invidious situation. And I've always thought that a monitoring officer should be from an alternative council or an outside person, because I know the law says it has to be an employee, but it's very difficult, I think, for an individual to come to a decision on a senior councillor, whether it be the leader or anyone else, and then sort of a couple of days later have to have a meeting with them on something totally different and act as though nothing had happened. It can create bad blood, and it does worry me.
I think Richard would just like to come back on that point.
That the situation the officer can be put into it can be difficult.
Yeah, I appreciate this is probably not a popularity exercise, is it, for the monitoring officer? Clearly, I will investigate complaints up to a certain level, and if they can be dealt with under that initial assessment, and a local resolution can be found, typically an apology if a member has done something wrong, or along those lines, then that's fine. If it's deemed that there is a serious breach of the code, I will then pass that over to an investigation, and you have a ethical governance hearing subcommittee that we've never had to invoke, thankfully, but members would carry out that investigation at that point. So again, with the independent person providing that advice. So it's only my assessment up to a certain point, and then I will hand that over. I do take the point, in the old days, of course, it was the old Standards Board for England. There was an external investigation, and they carried greater weight. But that was very bureaucratic, I guess, as to why that changed that process. And there is the local, again, we talk about the declarations of interest and the local action and the understanding at a local level. So you've got the sanctions on the criminalisation level, which is very harsh, potentially, for something that could be considered a minor misdemeanour, and we have no control over that. But then on the other hand, what you're saying is it would be better if that was almost passed over, potentially, to an independent who then doesn't have that local knowledge at that initial stage. So I think it's a fine balance to be had, isn't it?
Con Jameson.
Thank you, Chairman. I think the last thing we want to do is to go back to the Standards Board for England process, because it was, as you say, just awful. And I think we need to rely upon the professionalism of our officers and our members, because that's what we do. And I think that has worked incredibly well. And I don't see the need to go out unless particular circumstances dictate.
Thank you, members. I just wondered whether Ian had anything to add, since this does, comment about the independent person and your role within this setup.
Only to reassure members, Madam Chairman, that obviously the role of the independent person is not simply to confirm or otherwise the allegations that may be made by the public, but it's also to protect the members themselves. So that's a very important part of the independent person's role. It's not to sit on one side of the fence or the other. And I have to say, I was a member of the Standards Committee. Councillor Jameson may remember that I was with Mrs. Jameson. In fact, she was one of the other members. And yes, we did have to investigate one matter of alleged misconduct by one of the Christchurch members. And we made a decision on that, and it wasn't popular at the time, but I mean, at least we made a positive decision. But I do feel that the monitoring officer has the authority and exercises it correctly with the new procedure. We've not had many incidents in Christchurch which we've had to get together on, but we have in East Dorset, and they have been successfully investigated. On one occasion, in fact, the director got involved when the previous monitoring officer wasn't able to make a complete decision, or a decision acceptable. So the director got. So there is the director in the background.
Thank you, and it's really useful to have your input from your side of things as well. Thank you for that. Okay, so I believe we've given E a good airing. Shall we move on to F, which is sanctions? Are existing sanctions for councillor misconduct sufficient? 1. What sanctions do local authorities use when councillors are found to have breached the code of conduct? Are these sanctions sufficient to deter breaches and, where relevant, to enforce compliance? And 2. Should local authorities be given the ability to use additional sanctions? If so, what should these be? And I think this relates a bit to what Colin Jameson was saying earlier on, but if you'd like to read the draft response and then we can discuss it afterwards. Colin, would you like to start the discussion?
Yeah, I think that the comments made are appropriate, not relevant to the council as it is today. But as I said before, we're not writing this for today. We're writing it for a whole bunch of new people and a whole bunch of new officers who may be totally different. So I think that's balanced. And as you've already said, most things are resolved amicably, and people understand what's going on.
Thank you. Any other comments on F? If we're all happy with F, we'll move on to G, which is declaring interests and conflicts of interests. Are existing arrangements to declare councillors' interests and manage conflicts of interest satisfactory? If not, please say why. And 1. A local councillor is under a legal duty to register any pecuniary interests or those of their spouse or partner and cannot participate in discussions or votes that engage a disclosable pecuniary interest, nor take any further steps in relation to that matter, although local authorities can grant dispensations under certain circumstances. Are these statutory duties appropriate as they stand? And 2, what arrangements do local authorities have in place to declare councillors' interests and manage conflicts of interest that go beyond the statutory requirements? Are these satisfactory? If not, please state why. It's quite a long response, so I'll give you a bit of time to read through it. Colin Jameson.
Thanks, Chairman. I think the last paragraph does summarise it quite nicely. I think from my experience working at Dorset County as well as Christchurch Borough and also at the Parish Council, is that there perhaps, and I believe there is, a conversation had between the monitoring officers. I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong, so that it is consistent, and I think I'm not quite sure if that's reflected in here.
Chairman, I actually cover that in I think it's in K actually. No, it's not. It's in J where we talk about local. It is that the current system is reliant on local networks of offices. to have that dialogue, and that wouldn't necessarily always happen.
No.
And I think is the point I address in J as an enhancement that would be welcomed by local government generally. I think the only thing I would say on probably G, and I make reference to the flow chart that you've probably seen at various committee meetings. If I can just, we took this report to East Dorset as well, and we discussed the flow chart. They've actually asked if that can be added to the agenda pages. So on every committee agenda, you're probably familiar with that, is to actually include that flow chart. So as an addendum to the front pages. And again, we can do that. Daniel's already working on introducing that on the templates for all agendas going to committees to help members with their queries around declarations of interest in meetings.
Might I suggest also, Madam Chairman, then that is included in the Constitution under processes? I'm sure we can.
That looks like the general nods around the table for that. Is there any other comment or additions? Councillor Bungay.
Thank you, Chair. On the conflicts of interest, what is a conflict of interest? For instance, looking at planning or licensing, if you're sitting on that committee and an application comes in from a friend, personal friend, or someone you know quite closely, should you be declaring that or not?
And that is always the cloudy one. The pecuniary interest is nice and easy, isn't it? It's on your DPIs. You've got to declare it. You've got no choice. That then comes down to the bias and predetermination test. And so that is very much on this flowchart at the bottom. And it is the question, in all the circumstances, would it lead a fair-minded and informed observer to conclude that there was a real possibility or real danger that the decision maker was biased? So, and again, you will only know those facts. We don't know what they are. So as a monitoring officer, very difficult for me to give you advice as to whether a friendship, relationship, a acquaintance, a former working colleague, at that point, it has to be for you to determine on that particular point. And then the predetermination test is at the time of making the decision maker had a closed mind. So that's where you've clearly expressed a view outside of the meeting and come to a view on a particular matter. And you said, why am I approving that application? Clearly you're predetermined at that point and disqualified from the meeting. But the bias test is a very personal one that only you can really answer from that point of view.
Are you happy with that? Yeah. If we're all happy with that, I'm having a little choking fit. We'll move on to whistleblowing. H. What arrangements are in place for whistleblowing by the public, councillors and officials? Are these satisfactory? Draft response is at the top of the page, the next page. Are you all happy with that? Yep. Move on.
Can I just ask the naive question? Is that included within the Constitution?
Yes, it is. Yeah. Part 5, codes and protocols.
Move on to improving standards. I and J. What steps could local authorities take to improve local government ethical standards? And J. What steps could central government take to improve local government ethical standards? Responses are below.
Yeah, Madam Chairman, I think we have alluded to this already several times within the document, and it's a consistency across different authorities of different levels of authority, so that members and officers should be able to understand exactly where everybody sits within that structure. And I think that it's not too bad in Dorset, but it could be better.
Absolutely, we do. I mean, we do meet as monitoring officers on a regular basis to discuss matters, and that has improved in terms of advice and guidance we've given, particularly on things like dual-hatted members, where there was a variance in the advice being given in the past, but it is reliant on those local networks doing that. Nationally, that shouldn't need a different approach could actually negate the need for that, couldn't it, if there was a national code, national guidance, and it was much more rigid in terms of its advice and guidance to officers.
Madam Chairman, may I ask if monitoring officers have a conference on this? I mean, are monitoring officers trained in these aspects? Do you come together as monitoring officers and have I wonder what the collective noun is for monitoring officers.
Chairman, we do get together on a regular basis. I mean, we are meeting at the moment for various other reasons, but we were having regular meetings I think it was every other week or at least once a month on various things. And clearly, when we change codes or the advice changes, then clearly we do have that conversation. And as I said, that has changed various practices and advice that we've provided in the past. So it is an active group. We do meet on a regular basis.
But it's not really reflected in the draft response.
This section was really, section 1 was around what should local authorities take, or what steps should local authorities take, and the second one was J, was in terms of what should the government do. So the J is the one where a standardised approach can only be enforced by the government. We can't control that. I could again. I could again add a section, and we are doing it as good practice. We are holding a network of monitoring officers to discuss local issues, and in multi-tier areas, that would be an appropriate, perhaps at a county level. We can put that in.
Thank you. Anything else on I and J? No. Okay, we'll move on to K, and intimidation of local councillors. What is the nature, scale and extent of intimidation towards local councillors? What measures could be put in place to prevent and address this intimidation? And that's the last question, K. I'll let you read that and then we can make any comments. Colin Bungie.
Thank you, Chairman. First paragraph, limited intimidation of councillors. It goes on to say, I think I agree. Most of the intimidation comes within the political groups or being subject to bullying by officers. Now, I have raised this before. Why in our constitution is there no official way for a member who is intimidated or bullied by an officer to make a complaint about the officer? I believe, I'm not sure, but I believe in East Dorset it is in their constitution that members can make a complaint. But for some unknown reason, a few years ago, it was taken out of the Christchurch one. Thank you.
Chairman, forgive me, I don't know the constitution word for word, but I think they're almost identical between Christchurch and East Dorset. There is, as a monitoring officer, and I can't investigate complaints about officers' conduct. That's not for me to do that. I investigate complaints about members and parish and town councillors. What there is, though, clearly as officers, we are employed and we have a duty to abide by an officer code of conduct, and failure to abide by that officer code of conduct is then a disciplinary matter. So the complaint is made, and there, I think it's in part 5, section C of our protocol. I think we have a protocol for member and officer relations, and I think breaches of that, I think it says in there that is deemed to be a breach of the officer or member code, and if you ideally, coming back to my role as MO and members, it's about changing behaviour, maybe getting an apology, those sorts of issues to iron out potential conflicts. And on the officers' side, it would be a very much of a similar arrangement. So members and officers won't always see eye to eye. Where they don't, and that you would hope that the member and officer would resolve that amicably, first of all. If not, then it's a complaint to the line manager. If an officer isn't doing what they should be doing and they're stepping beyond their remit, then it's a complaint to that officer, to the officer's manager, and that manager will follow through, or will need to consider it as a complaint, and if appropriate, disciplinary action would follow. That's not for me to do, and that's not really for this committee to look at. That's then an employment issue, and if an officer behaved in a particular way that was deemed to be grossly misconduct, then they would be disciplined at a serious level and potentially dismissed. But there is another mechanism for that, and that's the employment law. And I'm not an employment lawyer, but those mechanisms are in the Constitution to follow through to the relevant line manager.
Okay with that response?
I'm not happy with that because having experienced this myself and tried to make a complaint and being told I can't do anything unless I go out and employ a lawyer to make a civil complaint, I find that for a member to be told that is not very satisfactory. And I think it's something that the Constitution needs to look at. It's not for this committee at this stage, but I think it's something that needs to be looked at in the Constitution if that's possible.
I think if you want to take it further with regards to the Constitution, we need to look at how we do that within the committee structure, but perhaps not for this discussion, as you say. Colin Jameson.
Thank you, Chairman. This will come to the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, and at that point we can have a broader discussion, I believe, on those particular things. We'll tease those out. It is coming to our committee, isn't it?
No, this committee is responsible for responding to this consultation paper.
Yes, indeed. But the point that was made, we are going to be looking at the Constitution shortly.
You're going to be looking at the scheme of delegation as approved by Council last week, the week before last week.
Last week.
In terms of the capacity of officers in relation to the delegation that Council approved. That was quite specific about that particular issue. So it's not going to cover this particular issue. But I have found the section, and there is, in that protocol that I was referring to, 3 paragraphs, formal complaints about officers, and it's very clear that you follow the employment code of conduct route for any complaints about officers. Okay. That is outside of this remit for that.
Might I ask Councillor Bungie that if he wishes to drop me a note, we can have it brought up at the next appropriate committee. Happy to do that, Chairman.
Any more comments on
yes,
K?
I do. Before we get to the end, and I know we're all anxious to go and listen to me play at my band practice, which starts in 15 minutes. I read this slightly differently. I read this as being intimidating. When I was chairing the planning committee, there was a lot of, I felt, intimidation from outside. And I think that the way we deal with that is by training. You know, there were decisions that the planning committee made which were the right decisions, but unpopular. And there was a lot of aggravation from the community about those decisions. And I did feel quite uncomfortable on occasion. Didn't change the decision, but you know, that's what it was. So I think the answer to that is, you know, how do you deal with difficult situations? Training.
Yeah, but possibly not for this consultation paper.
Well, it's what is the nature, scale, and extent of intimidation towards local councillors?
Would you like to add in a piece there about?
I think Richard is writing things down.
Again, actually, if I could just explain, at East Dorset, these sections were actually blank because they are really local, they are personal to members, aren't they? I think so. I can certainly take a note of that. In terms of the intimidation related to regulatory matters, I think generally, and certainly in terms of training, then dealing with difficult customers, dealing with those sorts of situations, we can put on training to tackle those particular issues for you.
you can, if I can just continue that a little bit, when we used to have the planning, when this room was laid out slightly differently, and you were very close to the members of the public, the gallery, and so I think you would have experienced this, the mutterings and the things when you're going on, you know, you're trying to make a rational decision based on all the facts and figures that you've got in front of you, and you continually get this pushing from the gallery, and we made it a bit smaller so that we created a little bit more distance to overcome that issue. But I think that to me are the intimidation things that go on actually while you're trying to make those decisions, sometimes in difficult circumstances.
So,
If I could follow on from that, I mean, it's not just in planning, and particularly recently, it has been at full council, where we have had quite a few vociferous people in the audience, and and again, the councillors can feel intimidated, where there is such a difficult decision to make. So as to how, I should imagine that the best way of dealing with it is having a strong chairman who will clear the room if there is a problem. There used to be a routine, and I'm looking at Colin to see, that if a member stood up, or if members stood up in a council meeting, that could then clear the room. Does that still exist?
Yes.
You're looking a bit... Because that used to come from a very sort of experienced freeman, wasn't it? I think we did it once with Eric.
I can't remember it ever having been used on a committee I was sitting on. Certainly if the mayor stands up in full council, then everybody sits down and shuts up, because the mayor has the prerogative then to say, I'm clearing the chamber, or I'm shutting off the debate now, we will adjourn for 10 minutes, whatever. A committee chairman, I think, can do the same thing. They can say, if it's getting a bit rowdy in the people listening, the chairman can stop the debate, leave, close it down, say we're adjourning for 10 minutes, everybody leaves the chamber, and the chamber can be cleared.
I think Richard's nodding, and I think you've summarised that very well. Thank you. So we're saying, do we want to add something in about intimidation in public meetings?
Yeah, I can certainly add all meetings. I think it was raised clearly at both. There is a tendency, there has been a tendency for that to be increased. And I think to mitigate that and address that particular issue is about training for all councillors, but also chairmen of committees and council to manage meetings, and an understanding of the rules and procedures that exist to control the meeting and the public.
Yes.
At the same time, I think members have to realise that sometimes the subjects that are being debated are very emotive for the people that are sitting in the public gallery listening. And yes, they can get upset, maybe justly so, and it is sometimes very difficult, as you know, when we're sitting in debate and you can't, you want to say something because you want to come back on something that's just been said, and you're told you've already spoken, you can't speak anymore, and that is frustrating. And to be sitting out there and thinking something is an injustice or something is wrong, I think we have to be a little bit more thick-skinned and sort of within reason. I mean, if it got rowdy and people started throwing eggs or tomatoes, that sort of thing, obviously that's totally unacceptable. But within reason, I think we have to accept that on occasions, when it's a very emotive subject, you will get a little bit of muttering and chatter from the people in the gallery, and the chairman can control that quite well by just stopping the debate at that stage and just saying to public, if you keep this up, we will clear the chamber. But we have to understand that we have been put here by the public, and in some perfectly common sense, they have a right to mutter their feelings, if not get violent and start throwing chairs about. But you know, we have to be a little bit more thick-skinned, I think, sometimes.
Thank you for that, Colin. So are we all happy with the response for K? So that gets to the end of that agenda item. We'll go back to the start of it for the recommendation. Can find it? Which is, thank you, it's recommended that members consider the questions posed in the consultation paper and prepare a response on behalf of the council. I think we've had a good debate and discussion on all of the aspects of the discussion points that we've been asked to comment on, and I thank the officer, Richard, for putting them together, because it was very comprehensive and gave us a very good starting point for our debate. So do I have a proposer for that recommendation? Okay, Sally proposed and Colin Jameson seconded. All those in favour? That's unanimous. So that is carried, and therefore...
Can I just say that's with the slight modifications and alterations that were asked for?
Absolutely. You modified response E to include reference to the fact that you understand, or you've been advised by myself that there's no undue pressure, including about where appropriate an independent investigator may be appointed. We then altered I in relation to it would be appropriate at a local level to set up monitoring officer network groups, and as we do, endorse it as good practice. And in K, obviously, we just talked about the intimidation at meetings and the possible training for councillors, chairman, and an understanding of controlling those meetings. But I take Councillor Bungey's points about the public.
Thank you for that, and thank you, members. And that point will close the meeting.